David had always been a man of routine. He woke up at 5:30 in the morning, drank his black coffee without sugar, and set out for another day of work in the construction company he helped build from scratch. At 58, he was a successful businessman, respected in the real estate industry. But behind the facade of a ruthless businessman, there was a pain that had consumed him for almost 3 decades. That Wednesday morning, David followed his routine to the letter. He put on his impeccable Italian suit, grabbed his leather briefcase, and went down to the lobby of the luxurious building where he lived. As usual, he opened the transportation app to request a car. While he waited, he mentally reviewed the topics of the important meeting he would have in less than an hour. When the car arrived, the businessman rushed into the back seat, barely looking at the driver. It was only when he heard the youthful voice asking, "Good morning, sir. Where are we going?" It was then that he finally looked up. What he saw made his heart race instantly. The driver was a young man of about 30, with dark hair and penetrating brown eyes. There was something extremely familiar about that face. Those deep eyes reminded him of someone. David felt a lump in his throat. With trembling hands, he picked up his phone to confirm the driver's name. Victor. For a few seconds, David was paralyzed. That name, so common to many, was loaded with meaning and pain for him. It was the name he had chosen for his son 30 years ago, the son who had disappeared along with his wife Anne, leaving a void that could never be filled. "Sir, are you okay?" The young driver's voice brought him back to reality. David cleared his throat, trying to disguise his disturbance. Yes. Sorry. To the business center, please." Throughout the entire journey, David couldn't take his eyes off the rearview mirror, observing every detail of the driver's face. The resemblance to Anne was undeniable. The same shape of the nose, the prominent cheekbones. Was it just a coincidence? Or was destiny finally giving him a clue after so many years? David decided to start a conversation, trying to sound as casual as possible. "So, Victor, how long have you been working as a driver?" The young man smiled, his eyes shining in the rearview mirror. "Oh, it's been about 2 years now. I started to supplement my income while finishing my degree in business administration." "Interesting," David replied, his heart beating faster and faster. "And are you from around here?" Victor hesitated for a moment. "Actually, I'm not sure. I've lived here for years, but I grew up in an orphanage since I was a baby. So, I'm not sure if I'm really from here." Those words hit David like a punch in the stomach. He felt short of breath, his hands started to sweat cold. He tried to maintain his composure, but his mind was in turmoil. "I'm sorry," was all he could say. Victor shrugged, keeping his eyes on the road. "You get used to it, you know. The nuns at the orphanage were like mothers to me, and now I have my own family, my fiancée Camila and our dog Rex." David smiled, despite the anguish he felt. It was strange to hear about the life of that young man who could have been his son, a whole life that he could not witness. Meanwhile, his mind travelled back in time. He remembered when he met Anne in the 90s, a young teacher full of dreams. They fell in love quickly and soon decided to get married. The pregnancy came as a surprise, but it filled them with joy. David worked hard as a construction worker to provide the best for his family. When the opportunity arose to work on a major project in another city, David hesitated. The salary was tempting, but it meant being away from Anne and the baby who was on the way. After much discussion, they decided it was the right thing to do. David would leave but return whenever possible. The first few months were difficult but filled with hope. David saved every penny, dreaming of the day he could bring his family to live with him. The weekly calls were the highlight of his days. Hearing Anne's voice and the first sounds of little Victor filled him with the strength to carry on. It was during one of those calls that Anne, with a tense voice, mentioned that her brother Carlos was going through difficulties. She didn't go into details, but David had learned enough to understand. Carlos had always been impulsive, and got involved with people who were not good company. Anne, however, spoke with such care and concern that David knew she still loved him, despite everything. She didn't say it directly, but he noticed. She remained his sister, and even knowing his mistakes, her protective instinct prevailed. David was firm, as always, and said he didn't want Carlos near his family, but there was something in Anne's voice that unsettled him. There was a weight, a sadness that he couldn't quite identify, but it stayed in his mind, and as he feared, it seemed that it was already too late. 2 weeks passed without a word from Anne. Worry took hold of David, and in near desperation he asked for leave from his boss and caught the first bus back home. What he found was a nightmare. The house was empty, as if it had been abandoned. The neighbours were silent, but the furtive glances and whispers were enough to tell the story. An older woman, visibly apprehensive, spoke softly, almost as if she didn't want to get involved but couldn't help but tell. I heard screams. For days. I don't know. It seemed like something was wrong. With each word, the feeling that everything had spiraled out of control intensified. David tried to find more answers, but no one seemed to want to talk much. His eyes scanned the surroundings, and his mind raced. Where were Anne, Victor, and Carlos? He didn't want to believe it, but the thought that something had happened to all of them tormented him. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and years passed. David exhausted all his savings hiring private detectives, pleaded with the authorities for any help, moved heaven and earth. Nothing. It was as if Anne and Victor had been swallowed by absence itself, disappearing without a trace. Over time, the pain did not diminish, but David learned to live with it. He focused on work, climbing the career ladder until becoming a partner at the construction company. Professional success came as a form of compensation for everything he had lost, but not all the money in the world could fill the emptiness in his heart. And now, almost 30 years later, fate played this trick on him. A young Uber driver, with the same name and age his son would have had, orphaned since infancy. The coincidences were too many to ignore. When they arrived at the destination, David felt he couldn't let that opportunity slip by. With his heart in his throat, he leaned forward. Victor, I know this is going to sound strange, but have you ever considered looking for your biological family? The young man seemed surprised by the question. I've thought about it a few times, but I never knew where to start. Why? David took a deep breath. It was now or never. Because I lost my son almost 30 years ago. He would be your age today, and his name was Victor. The silence that followed was deafening. Victor looked at David through the rearview mirror, his eyes wide with surprise and confusion. Do you think I could be? David nodded, feeling tears form in his eyes. I know it sounds crazy, but the coincidences are too many. Your name, your age, the fact that you grew up in an orphanage. Look. He took a wallet from his pocket, and from it removed an old faded photograph. In it, a young woman smiled, holding a baby in her arms. This is Anne, my wife, and this is Victor, our son, just 6 months old. Victor took the photo with trembling hands. His eyes went from the image to David's face, searching for similarities. This is crazy, he murmured. David agreed. I know. But what if it's not just coincidence? What if it's fate giving us a second chance? The young driver seemed shocked, unable to process all of it. I don't know what to say. How can we be sure? There is a way, David replied, his voice choked with emotion. A DNA test. I know it's a lot to ask, but would you consider doing it? After David's request to take the DNA test, Victor fell silent for a moment, his thoughts in turmoil. The idea that this man could be his biological father left him stunned. He always felt that something was missing, a piece that never fit. Perhaps it was a moment when he most needed a father figure. He felt so lost and empty, not knowing what direction to take in life. Why not? He thought to himself, wondering if he was finally facing a chance to fill the void that had accompanied him for so long. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right, let's do the test. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of David's life. He could barely concentrate at work, his mind constantly returning to Victor and the possibility of having found his long-lost son. He called the laboratory daily, asking if the result was ready yet. Victor, in turn, was on an emotional roller coaster. He always tried to understand his past, but he never imagined he could find his biological family in such an unexpected way. Part of him was excited about the possibility, another part apprehensive. What if the test came back negative? And if it was positive, how would it change his life? Finally, the big day arrived. David and Victor met at the laboratory, both too nervous to talk. When the doctor entered the room with the envelope containing the results, the air became heavy with tension. Gentlemen, the doctor began, the DNA test confirms with 99.99% certainty that there is a paternal relationship between you. The world seemed to stop for a moment. David and Victor looked at each other, tears streaming freely down their faces. Without saying a word, they embraced, 3 decades of longing and repressed love finally finding release. "My son," David whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I finally found you." Victor sobbed, clinging to the father he never knew. "I always wanted to know where I came from. I always felt like something was missing." In the days that followed, father and son spent hours talking, filling the gaps of 30 years spent apart. David talked about Anne, about how they had fallen in love, and about the joy they felt when Victor was born. He spoke about the pain of separation, about the years of fruitless searching. Victor, in turn, talked about his childhood in the orphanage, about the doubts and insecurities of growing up without knowing his origins, about how he built his life, his dreams and achievements. Together, they began to investigate what really happened on that fateful night 30 years ago. They went in search of answers, armed with the new information from Victor. On the day in question, the women who worked at the orphanage remembered seeing Anne and the day everything happened. She seemed in shock, left the baby wrapped in a small towel embroidered with his name, and fled without giving any information. They also discovered an old police record that matched Anne. Upon cross-referencing the dates, they understood that Anne had died a few hours after leaving Victor at the orphanage, but her action had saved his life. This gesture of love was remembered as proof that even in the midst of despair she chose to protect her son. The revelation was a shock to both, but it brought an end to years of uncertainty. Together, they spent hours talking about Anne, allowing Victor to learn more about his mother and her story. There, the cycle of pain found its conclusion. Now the opportunity arose to rebuild what time had taken away. David and Victor had before them the chance to truly become father and son, not just on paper, but in the creation of new memories and the bonding that had always been missing. For David and Victor, it was the beginning of a new journey, a journey of reconnection, healing, and above all, love. They knew the path would not be easy, that many challenges lay ahead. But they were determined to face them together, as the family they should always have been. David met Victor's fiancée and heard about her story. Watching his son, he felt for the first time that the emptiness in his heart was beginning to fill. Meanwhile, Victor, embracing the father he never imagined finding, experienced a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. Fate had given them a second chance, and they were determined not to waste it. After all, the love of a father for a son, and that of a son for a father, is a force capable of overcoming even the most unlikely circumstances. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 5 to show how much you liked it. Also, watch the video that is now appearing on your screen. See you soon.